So first of all, just say it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I was delighted when Leona and Steve asked me to come. I've heard so much about this conference, mainly from patients that come here and then come back and tell me about it. So it's great to see what actually goes on here. And the guys gave me an interesting title for my talk, the why, what, who, how, and not quite where, of UK clinical research. And I think one of the reasons I was asked to give this particular talk is that I think it's incredibly frustrating when you hear all this fantastic science, and it's often with the phrase, and this is coming into a clinical trial sometime soon, next 1 to 2 years. Why does it take so long? Why do we need the clinical trials? Why not just give the drugs if they're out there and the science looks so good? And so what I want to do is just walk through a little bit of each of these points and try and answer the question about why we do clinical trials at all. And a little bit, I just thought I'd come back to some basics about what is a clinical trial. I think you've had a lot of information thrown at you this morning. I am so impressed by how much you can take on board, but just a few basics about what a clinical trial actually is. And then who does them? How do we do this in the UK? And the delivery of it. Why does it take so long? Why does it cost so much money? And then some nice news at the end. So, why? Why do we do a clinical trial at all? And I just want you to think about when you sit in the clinic with your doctor. I picked a few photographs actually of paediatric oncologists, but I thought none of them would be happy if I put them in the middle of this page. So I went for a cartoon. But you know, you sit and you listen to your doctor who's made the diagnosis and then tells you this is what we're going to do. And how do they make that decision? And that decision is partly from training. They've been to medical school, they've learnt lots of stuff, and then they've trained to be a ologist of some sort, paediatric oncologist, surgeon, radiotherapist, and that's all that training is brought into that decision. And then they gain experience. They get a little bit older. Some of us are older than others. And as we've gone along and we've seen lots of patients and we've got to know a bit about what our colleagues are doing, we bring that experience to the clinic. And then we call a friend. We have lots of other paediatric oncologists, radiotherapists, surgeons, have lots of experience, and we work together. And we work together in networks in the UK, and we work together in networks globally. So what often your paediatric oncologist is telling you is based on what he knows or she knows, what the rest of the country knows, what Europe knows, and probably what America knows. But it also needs to be based on research. It needs to be based on hard evidence, not just us all having a chat about what the best thing to do is. And so what is that evidence? Well, there's a hierarchy in evidence, and this is well known in clinical research. An expert opinion matters because it's built on what people have actually done. But then you put together reports on things that are a bit different, how patients have been treated, how they've been responded, and that gets published in the literature. And the next level of evidence is where you have a lot of patients with a similar disease who've been treated in a similar way, and you collect that together, sometimes in a registry, and you publish that to say, if you treat 100 children this way, this is what happens. But to really understand whether a treatment works properly, you need to do it in a very controlled way, that you take all the biases out, all the passion and the interest and the does this actually work question, and that's what a clinical trial does. And there's one higher bit of evidence, and that's called a systematic review. And that's when you take the data from all the clinical trials in that area, and not just the clinical trials, but the expert opinion, the cohort studies, all the evidence that's published, and synthesize it together and say, I think this is the best way to treat this particular patient. And this is what's called a hierarchy of evidence or increasing strength. So I've said a clinical trial is a high level of evidence, but what actually is it? And there's lots of different definitions on the website. This is the one that I like best. It's basically research to work out, to measure if a treatment works, what the side effects are in patients. So you saw the hospital, as Louis called it. Laboratory scientists do it in animals, in mice, in the clinic. They do it in laboratory test tubes. They can give you a lot of evidence about whether a drug or a combination of drugs that's interesting based on some biology. But a clinical trial is when we actually do it in the patients. And what we're really asking is the balance, and there's side effects to every drug. Even paracetamol's got side effects. So the balance is, does the benefit to the tumour outweigh the side effects? And that's basically what we're looking for in its simplest terms. And we talk about phases of trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. This is becoming a bit old-fashioned now because the margins between these trials are definitely blurring as we do more modern types of trials. But broadly, there are the early trials and the late trials. I'm going to talk about just what they actually are. So what is an early phase trial? Most of what you've heard, I think, today and probably going to hear for the rest of the next 2 days are about results of early phase trials. And early phase trials take these fantastic new drugs into the clinic and work out, is that treatment safe? Is it the right thing to do? And because very rarely one drug, there's a fantastic slide earlier on about the results from melanoma with checkpoint inhibitors, but it's not often you get a fantastic result with just one drug. So what we really need to know is, can you combine that drug with another fantastic new drug, or can you combine it with standard chemotherapy? And we do these in early phase trials as well. Is it safe to put those drugs together? And I keep saying, is it best? And what does best mean? And best means that you get the best dose to give the response you want with the least amount of side effects, and says it's always a balance. But it's not just about safety. What you want to know, what we want to know is, does the drug work? Does it actually have a response? And you keep hearing, and I've heard it this morning a few times, the activity of a drug. It's got clinical activity. What does that mean? In early phase trials, we talk about response rates, and so just little cartoons about what this means. Doctors talk about disease being stable. So you started on a trial and your disease hasn't got any worse. Now that's a response because the disease probably would have progressed without that treatment, but it is stable disease. It might get better but doesn't go away, and that's called a partial response. And that could just be one spot getting smaller or some of the spread getting less, but that's called a partial response. Of course, what we really want is a complete response. The disease goes away altogether. And then unfortunately, it doesn't always work and we get progressive disease. And it's, does this work? Right way around? Yep. These bits here, stable disease, partial response and complete response, often get all put together, and that's called clinical activity. So just to put it into perspective, when you hear that a drug is active, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always this, which is what we want, but it's showing that it's either halting the disease or starting to shrink it. But that's good, because that means there's a drug that, in the most difficult possible circumstance, which is when you do early phase trials, when the conventional treatments aren't working anymore, you're getting some evidence of activity. But when you get that, you need to do the next step, and that's a late phase trial. And this is where we ask, is the treatment actually better than what we've already got? Can it replace the existing treatment, or can we modify an existing treatment? And this is the key. Can we actually cure more patients with this new treatment with less side effects? And we can do this, and these are randomized controlled trials, and randomized because we're comparing A with A plus the new treatment, or completely A versus the new treatment, or maybe modifying A and adding a new treatment in. So you're comparing the two. And so you are looking for complete responses in these late phase trials, but you're actually saying, is that complete response prolonged? Do you get a prolonged complete remission? And by this we mean, are we getting a long-term cure? And this is what, in trials terms, we talk about survival rates. And so this is really what the endpoint of a late phase trial is looking at. So responses in early phase trials and late phase trials, it's the overall survival. And this is really important in terms of developing drugs. Now, all of that goes into when you take a drug from the laboratory into the clinic and then becomes standard of care. All that data has to be put together. So who does this? Well, in the UK, we have quite a complex infrastructure, but it does work. It's slow, but it does work. And the ideas for the trials come from clinicians, usually. And the lead clinician of a trial is called a chief investigator. And they usually work with clinical trials units, and I'm going to explain a bit about a clinical trials unit. And then the trials are done in the hospitals, and the hospitals are called trial sites. And obviously, it's the patients and families that make the actual trials work. In this country, we've got something called the National Institute for Health Research, which is run by the NHS. And so the whole structure of clinical trials in this country, whether it's cancer or not cancer, comes under this NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, that invest in the hospitals and sometimes directly in the trials units to conduct clinical trials. In cancer, we were the first disease to have what's called a National Cancer Research Network. It's a network across the country, not quite across the country because it's England and not Scotland, but they've got their own up in Scotland in the devolved nations. But it is a network that brings money to hospitals based on the number of patients they recruit. So there is investment in clinical research in this country. And then on the other side, on the academic side, we have something called the National Cancer Research Institute. And this brings together clinicians in groups called clinical study groups. And there's a specific clinical study group for childhood cancer and leukemia. And this is all the experts, I think just about everybody sitting in this room is a clinicians on our clinical study group, as are parents, and Nick's on our clinical study group, and statisticians. And it's these people that really say, what trials should we be doing in this country for children with cancer and leukemia? And there's a number of subgroups that feed into this study group, and there's a dedicated one to neuroblastoma. The trials units are all accredited by a government agency called the UK Clinical Research Collaborative, and they accredit us every 5 years. And at the moment there's 46 around the country, 2 in Birmingham, and they do every single type of disease, not just cancer. But a subset of us do cancer almost exclusively. And there's 15 of us at the moment, and Birmingham sits here in the middle. And the trials unit in Birmingham is one of the largest dedicated cancer research trials units in the country. So this is my team. This is my team 2 years ago. It's expanded a bit more. We can't fit in one room anymore. There's 200 of us now. And we're based in Birmingham. We have a core grant every year from Cancer Research UK that funds about a quarter of the team, and the rest of the money comes from different funding sources. Who are these people? Well, we comprise clinicians, people like myself, who've got expertise in clinical trials. We've got about 20 statisticians that design and analyse the trials. We've got 10 trial management teams, and I'll introduce you to one of them in a minute. We've got a bunch of IT specialists who program databases. We've got regulatory experts, and then we've got an admin team and a finance team. And what we've got is a dedicated team, especially for childhood cancer trials. This is the team last year. Again, it's expanded. I can't keep photographing them because they keep expanding. They're led by this lady here, Nikki. And the lady just sitting to her right we've just split the team into 2 because we've got so much work to do. And so there's now 2 joint team leaders. There's Nikki and Anna. We're the only trials unit in the country that has a dedicated childhood cancer trials team, and Cancer Research UK invested specifically on this team. And they are supported across the rest of the trials unit. So it isn't just them. They're supported by statisticians, programmers, QA people all across the unit. And we manage over 90% of all the childhood cancer trials in the country. Now, I say all, not the industry trials. The industry manage their own trials. We're talking about academic trials. And we deliver the trials in all the specialist centres around the country, all 21 specialist oncology centres around the country. But we also work internationally. Where's the lady from Australia? We do trials in Australia. We also are collaborating with Japan, with the US and Canada, but mostly in Europe. And the ITCC that Steve mentioned, which I'm involved in, is an academic consortium that specifically works on early phase clinical trials. And the European Society of Paediatric Oncology is a group of clinicians across the whole of Europe that focus on both early and late phase clinical trials. So not only do we deliver trials in Europe, Australia and America, well, not so much America, but Europe and Australia, but we also participate in the trials that are generated the other way. So it's a two-way flow. So what does the trials unit actually do? Well, we do everything from helping design the trial to delivering it, to getting the money, to analysing the data and publishing it. And we train investigators as well so that we can train them about how to do clinical trials. But what is it that we're training them to do? How do we actually do it? Well, there's a roadmap, and it basically goes from the design through to publishing. So we have to work out what's the question, get the money to do it, set the trial up, open it in the hospital, get all the patients in, get all the data in, close it, analyse it and publish it. Straightforward. Easy. This bit can sometimes be the hardest bit, securing the funding. But all of this, particularly from trial set up down, is regulated by laws. And it's regulated by all of these laws. And actually in 2019, there'll be another one, but it will replace that one. And the whole purpose of all these laws, and it's these laws that make it incredibly slow and clunky to open trials, but the aim of the laws are to protect trial patients and to ensure the data is accurate and honest. And that's what clinical trials units have expertise in. And just in case you think, well, surely doctors wouldn't do anything wrong. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Sadly, that wasn't the case. And this all started around the war, Nuremberg, with prisoners of war being experimented on without their consent. And that's what really triggered all of this in the first place. Medicines Act was brought in after the thalidomide disaster. You know, when a drug wasn't properly designed, or at least the trial wasn't properly designed to take into account of the potential long-term side effect on pregnant women and on their offspring. So although you think, there's a lot of paperwork in this, actually it was done for a good reason. Now, bureaucracy is quite hard now, but we just have to remember that when we're doing this, it is actually to protect patients. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, and we have to remember that when people want to get their drug into the clinic, they're motivated by different things. They're motivated by the belief that their drug's the best thing ever, because they've done all the research in it. Industry's invested a lot of money. Scientists have invested a lot of money, and they want to do the best for patients. And sometimes you need to go, let's just check this is the right thing to do in the right set of patients, and that the data is actually better for patients. So before we completely dismiss the regulations as being a pain in the neck, and trust me, I say that quite often, they really are there for a reason. So in the UK, we're governed by something called the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA, and they govern trials that have drugs in them or medical devices. And they're the agency that come and inspect us all the time, and we have to send all the trials to them to make sure they're okay. We're also governed by something called the Health Research Authority, which is an NHS body, and they're saying, can we actually deliver the trial in the UK? Is it feasible to do this trial in the NHS, in our hospitals? Can we afford it? And they also govern the Research Ethics Committee. They're asking if the research is ethical and whether it's doing anything that's not protecting a patient. So how much does it cost to run a trial? Well, what does you pay for? What you pay for is all the staff that are running it. The regulators charge. We have to ensure patients are in trials in case anything goes wrong. All the meetings that go towards designing the trial. We usually don't have to pay for the drugs. Industry usually pays for the drugs, but sometimes we have to pay for how to deliver them. There's research costs. So if your trial is asking for another test that wouldn't normally be what a patient would have, we have to pay for that test. And then we have to pay for the research that people like Louis do in the laboratories. And then there's just administrative costs. Fortunately, as we're going more and more electronic, this bit is the actual bit that's going down a lot. How much do you think a trial costs per year? Numbers? It's roughly, and it is roughly because it varies from trial to trial, somewhere between 150 to £200,000 a year to run a trial. If you run a trial for 5 years with the 5-year follow-up, we're into millions. So it's not cheap to run a clinical trial. So you need to make sure your trial's worthwhile doing in the first place. Who pays for it? Well, I said the NHS puts some money in, and they do. The whole infrastructure of running clinical trials is supported by the NHS. But we also apply for grants, and we can apply to the NHS NIHR. We can apply to the Department of Health, not so much for childhood cancer trials, to be honest. We can apply to the EU, at least we can just now, maybe not in a couple of years. We apply to industry. Industry give us educational grants to run clinical trials, and it's incredibly important that we partner with the industry to do it. But we get an awful lot of money from charity, and we get a lot of money from Cancer Research UK. But we also get money from Children with Cancer, who are running one of our biggest trials, which is a leukemia trial. Solving Kids Cancer contribute to a lot of our neuroblastoma work. Bloodwise on our lymphoma trials, and a European charity called Imagine for Margot is funding several of our early phase trials. So once we've got the funding, that's the red bits, all this has to happen. Everything from the paperwork through to the closing of the trial. And I'm just going to break this down into a couple of steps, but it feels like this. And this isn't Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham, but it does look a bit like it. There is actually one more complicated. And sometimes you do feel like you'll never come back out again and actually have a trial. But if we take it in the steps, the most important part of any trial is the protocol. And this is the manual. You know, it's like your recipe. It's the thing you have to follow. And as long as you stick to the protocol, then everybody in the hospital, in the labs, in the pharmacy are all doing the same thing. We've got a robust trial, and it's this the regulators check. This is what we spend a lot of time writing. We need to make sure the data is robust. So all the stuff that happens to a patient on a clinical trial needs to be collected into a database, and that database, the data needs to be accurate, and we need to protect the data. We need to make sure it's safe and no one can tamper with it. We need to pick the right hospital. Birmingham Children's Hospital. We actually check the doctors are qualified. I don't mean they're qualified to be doctors, but qualified to run a clinical trial. They know what they're doing, that they've got the right facilities to do it, and they actually have the patients to put on the trial. We do all the submissions, and there's so many committees. So every committee has to review what we do, but it goes from everything from checking it's ethical to being authorised to being on the NIHR portfolio, so the NHS will invest in it, to the actual hospital itself approving the study. So all that has to happen. Just like to say we do it in parallel. This doesn't all happen sequentially. We have 100 contracts, maybe not 100, we have lots of contracts for every single clinical trial. And we have a contract with the funder, with any collaborators, with service providers. So for example, a courier that takes a sample from a patient to a lab to test it, to check that patient's eligible, we have to pay for all that couriering, and we need a contract to say they'll do what they said they will do. And we also have to have a contract with the hospital so to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And finally, we can open up the hospital. So once all that's in place, we train the staff, we start the trial, and we recruit the patients. And then while the trial's ongoing, we check it's all going okay. There's oversight committees that we coordinate. So we keep letting the funders know what's happening. We let the regulators know what's happening. We have an independent steering committee that checks that we're not doing anything wrong. And we have a safety committee that makes sure that the trial is being run in a safe way. And then finally, when it's completed, we analyse the data and we present the results. And everybody loves going to a conference to present their results, and we need to get them to write it up and actually publish it. And I think this is really important. We need to feed back in lay terms the results of the trials to the people that were involved in the trials in the first place. And then all this contributes to the evidence pyramid to actually improve patient care. So we come right back to the beginning now. So having done all that, we need to actually make a difference in the clinic. So in Birmingham, in our trials unit, I just wanted to show you the activity that we have. We took over the children's cancer trials on 1st of April 2010. So we've been doing it 7 years, and we've doubled the number of clinical trials for children with cancer in this country, academic clinical trials. And one of our great increases has been in the early phase, in the drug development trials, but also in late phase trials. And a lot of our trials are now international. So these are all the trials that we run from our unit across Europe, and some of them open in Australia as well. This trial we're just opening up in Australia too. And this is our flagship neuroblastoma trial. So in neuroblastoma, we've got a number of early phase trials. Some of them may be familiar to you. So there's the Beacon trial, the Ludo trial, so IMAT trial, and the GD2 long-term infusion, which is now in follow-up. It's not recruiting at the moment. Planned, we've got eSmart funded, which, although it's not a purely neuroblastoma trial, children with neuroblastoma will be eligible, and you saw it'll have a lot of different arms in it, depending on the molecular profile of children with cancer, and I'm sure there will be a lot of children with neuroblastoma will become eligible for this trial. We've got a trial called PARC, which is a trial with a very unusual and interesting way to target cancer, looking at the metabolism, and this will be open to neuroblastoma patients. And then we've got the next iteration of Beacon. I'm going to show Beacon in a second, and a whole load of other studies. CRISP as well is being considered by CR UK at the moment, so hopefully the study that Louis mentioned we will open in the UK. Beacon, this is an example of this is the trial that's open for children with relapsed refractory neuroblastoma. Lucas, who's in the room, leads this study, and we run it across Europe with each country doing everything I've just said under our auspices in their own country. And this is a trial that started off with 4 arms. It now has 6 arms, and we're looking to amend it to see if we can bring in some new agents to keep adapting this as a rolling design in an efficient way. So instead of going back to the beginning of all that process, we can start adding new arms as we get new drugs that might be interesting for neuroblastoma. For late phase studies, we were responsible for helping deliver the high-risk neuroblastoma trial in the UK, which was led from Austria. But you can see this trial started a long time ago, and the new trial is being designed and hopefully will be open in the next few years. And we're waiting for the outcome from CR UK for a trial called Veritas, which is a late phase trial for resistant neuroblastoma. So there's a lot of activity going on. But it's not quick enough. We need to be quicker. So how do we do that? We're doing everything we can to make our trials unit more efficient, not only how we work in the UK, but how we work in Europe. But we've had some fantastic interactions with Solving Kids Cancer. And just recently, they have awarded us a grant to fund a dedicated senior trial coordinator specifically to look after our neuroblastoma trials, to help us accelerate that delivery so we can get from the concept to the first child into the trial much, much quicker. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Solving Kids Cancer, because they have been very generous in understanding what the challenges are and have given us this post, which we hope will go out to advert in the very near future. And we'll get a good person in to do this, who will hopefully be at next year's conference. So finally, getting the drug you want for your child that's going to make a difference to your child is unbelievably frustrating when the trial isn't open today. And we are doing everything we can to accelerate it. But it is incredibly important that the work that is done to develop that drug is done through a properly designed clinical trial that's conducted well, so the results we get mean something, and then we can get it into the NHS for every child with neuroblastoma and every child with cancer to benefit from the outcomes of these trials. So when you go and see your doctor, the evidence base he has is based on something very robust, and that's what we're aiming to do. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening.